Well, hundreds of people are gathering today across the country for protests, both for and against Planned Parenthood. In Washington, an anti-abortion group called Protest PP held a rally outside the Supreme Court before walking to a local Planned Parenthood office. At the same time, pro-abortion rights activists are holding counter-protests. CBS News correspondent Errol Barnett is in Washington. Errol, what's the argument being made by the side calling for defunding Planned Parenthood?
Well, these abortion rights opponents, which attempted to coordinate some 200 separate demonstrations across the country today, at Planned Parenthood locations, believe that funds that Planned Parenthood receives from the government essentially subsidize their abortion efforts. Now, we should make it clear that the federal law already states that money cannot be used for abortions, but Planned Parenthood does receive roughly $500 million per year through subsidies, reimbursements for Medicare coverage. And what these groups say is that they would rather federal funding go toward groups that do not provide abortion services at all, smaller clinics and other clinics. What Planned Parenthood says is they offer other services, STD and cancer screenings, as well as contraception, and that if the 2.5 million people they service each and every year cannot benefit from those services in some 661 clinics throughout the country, then the other clinics, these rural clinics, would not be able to absorb their customers or the services they provide. So today's demonstrations, in which those who support abortion rights and Planned Parenthood also took to the streets, really personify that divide in the country on what is one of the most divisive issues.
And people who are for pro-abortion say that the organization is not just about abortion. What's their argument, Errol?
Well, what we saw today here in Washington was you had about a dozen anti-abortion rights activists demonstrating outside the Supreme Court and then heading to Planned Parenthood. But then you also, across the street, had dozens of pro-abortion rights supporters demonstrating for Planned Parenthood. And what they say is that, you know, this group only receives 40% of its funding from the federal government, but for those people who do receive services, typically in rural areas that people who don't have access to big hospitals and fancy clinics, oftentimes it can be teenagers, young women who are unable to get access to information, contraception, and other kind of benefits to health. They say if all of Planned Parenthood's federal funding is cut because of what is only a fraction of their services, that it would be detrimental to millions of people. So they try to coordinate this counter-protest today in many cities around the country as well.
And have GOP leaders weighed in, Errol? Any indication of what action they plan to take on abortion and trying to defund Planned Parenthood?
They have. Joni Ernst, the senator from Iowa, has already introduced legislation that would essentially cut the avenues of funding that Planned Parenthood already receives. There was a Department of Health and Human Services rule put in place under the Obama administration, which prohibited states from limiting federal funding to Planned Parenthood. This new legislation would essentially reverse that. And so Republicans have seen the election of Donald Trump partly on this wave of anti-abortion sentiment as something that they need to deliver on. And so there is considerations being made in the Republican Senate and House that would find avenues to cut this funding. But one important note we should make is that a lot of congressional leaders, while back in their hometowns over these past few days, have faced very vocal and frustrated constituents on a number of issues that include the possibility to defund Planned Parenthood. So it'll continue to be an issue debated among Republicans.
Errol, we know that President Trump nominated Judge Neil Gorsuch to the Supreme Court. We know he's a conservative, but where exactly does he stand on abortion rights?
Well, specifically on abortion rights, it's unclear. We can kind of look at his judicial background and see that in many cases he has ruled in favor of religious groups. The most famous case being the Hobby Lobby case, which was a kind of arts and crafts chain which disagreed with one aspect of the Affordable Care Act in which they would have to fund contraception coverage for its employees. They opposed that on religious grounds, and Judge Gorsuch agreed with them. A lot of conservative groups have hailed his decisions for favoring people who have decided that they don't want to take a specific action on religious grounds. He has not, though, ruled specifically on either Roe versus Wade or those aspects of if an abortion should be legal. But we should be clear that President Trump said he would appoint someone who could overturn Roe versus Wade. Vice President Pence addressed the March for Life here in Washington a few weeks ago, the largest gathering of anti-abortion rights activists. He was the highest ranking official to address them, and when he did, he said that life, the pro-life movement as it's called, is winning. So they feel very confident that with this new president, this Supreme Court nomination, it paves the way at least for a potential overturn of Roe versus Wade.
Lots of passionate people on both sides of this argument. Errol Barnett in Washington. Thank you, Errol.
You got it.